All right, welcome back to Tragedy and Hope Live. Gonna get right into the book here. The New Era, 1957 to 1964, on page 1138. It's like the third paragraph down. All right. Although the communist takeover in Cuba began in 1960, it was not until February 1962 that Castro began to realize what had happened. Within a month, particularly during the week of March 16th through 22nd, he eliminated the communists from most positions of significant power. The Rodriguez Economic Plan of November 1961 was denounced. The ORI system was purged. His brother, Raul Castro, was made vice premier. Escalante was forced into exile. The militia and bureaucracy were recaptured by the Fidelistas. And on March 26th, Fidel himself gave a 5-hour speech narrating what had happened. Pravda did not accept the change until April 11th. The acceptance of the reestablishment of Fidelism by both the Kremlin and the Cuban Communist Party, largely because they had no alternative, was followed by their full-scale support of the Castro regime in political and economic policies. On May 31st, it was announced that Moscow would provide 600,000 tons of food in the balance of 1962 to stave off the Cuban economic collapse, and later Moscow released claims on some Cuban sugar so that it could be sold in the world market for hard currencies. Above all, the Soviet Union appeared to accept Castro's argument that another American military assault on Cuba was in preparation. The United States, Castro, and Moscow all must have known that no effort was likely to be made to repeat the American invasion of Cuba, but Castro made the charge because he wanted Soviet weapons, and the Kremlin pretended to believe it for reasons that are still doubtful. It is possible that the Russians hoped that the Soviet IRBMs in Cuba would help to slow up the increasing American lead over the Soviet Union in the missile race. It is also possible that they hoped that such missiles, once established, might be bargained away in return for a Soviet-favored solution to the Berlin question. The increasing American aerial patrols over Cuba, which detected the Russian missile buildup on the island, were used by Cuba and the Soviet Union as evidence of the approaching American attack. By September, still unknown to the public, the crisis began to form, and in October it was in full progress, with the consequences already described. The ending of the Cuban Missile Crisis at the end of 1962 may have opened a new era in the world's history, but it left Latin America still floundering in the same old problems, which became more complicated and insoluble with each passing day. As we have said, these problems can be solved only by obtaining more constructive patterns in the proper priority sequence. On the whole, the role of the United States in Latin America has not been such as to help either patterns or priorities, largely because our concern has been with what seems to be useful or better for us rather than what would be most helpful to them. From the point of view of Latin America's real interest, basic priorities might include 5 things. 1. More constructive psychological patterns. 2. Increased political stability. 3. A greatly reduced birth rate with emphasis on the quality rather than the quantity of population. 4. A large increase in the food supply and in the most fundamental needs of human life, such as housing. 5. Increased emphasis on light industry, especially processing and semi-processing of local raw goods. And 6. Continued improvements in transportation and communications. This combination of advances could provide rising standards of living and jobs for everyone. In moving in this direction, much greater use should be made of local resources, including local capital and local skills, especially those of the present upper classes. This last point will become feasible only if the first 2 points begin to develop: a better outlook, especially in the upper classes, and a sufficiently stabilized political system so that duress can be put upon those classes to force them to use both their lives and their resources in a more constructive way. This will be possible only if the armed forces of Latin America and of the whole Pakistani-Peruvian axis move much more rapidly in the direction that they have been moving in already, but too slowly, the direction of increased concern for stronger, more honest, more constructive, and more widely distributed improvements in conditions of living among their own people. The point of view has already been shown itself along the Pakistani-Peruvian axis in military circles in Pakistan, Egypt, Argentina, and elsewhere, in the royal entourage in Iran, among university youth in much of Latin America, but in all these cities, despite the enthusiasm and energy that made it possible for them to overthrow corrupt and tyrannical regimes, it soon became clear that they have little idea what to do once they get into power. As a result, they fall under the personal influence of unstable and ignorant men, the Nassers, the Perones, and the Castros, who fall back on emotionally charged programs of hatred and spectacular displays of unconstructive nationalism that waste time and use up resources, while the real problems of the whole enormous area go unsolved. A heavy responsibility rests on the United States for this widespread failure to find solutions to problems all the way from Pakistan to Peru. The basic reason for this is that our policies in this great area have been based on efforts to find solutions to our own problems rather than theirs. To make profits, to increase supplies of necessary raw materials, to fight Hitler, to keep out communism, and in recent years to fight the Cold War and prevent the spread of neutralism. The net result of our actions has been that we are now more hated than the Soviet Union, and neutralism reveals itself as clearly as it dares throughout the whole area. This is perhaps more obvious on the Pakistan end of the axis than on the Peruvian end, but it is true from one end to the other. Dulles' insistence on arming the Middle and Near East and seeking to line the area up into a military bulwark against the Soviet Union destroyed the precarious political stability of the area, intensified local rivalries and animosities as between India and Pakistan or between Egypt and Israel, led to large-scale waste of resources and energies on armament rivalries, divided the armed forces into cliques whose rivalries increased the frequency of military coups, and often entrenched in power reactionary and unprogressive minorities. The sad thing about all this is that it was so unnecessary. There never was a moment in which the arms of the Axis, including Turkey and Israel, contributed anything significant to keeping the Soviet Union out of it, even less so in Latin America. On the contrary, the Dulles efforts to bring both areas into the Cold War in a military way by treaties and armaments have succeeded only in bringing Soviet influence and communism in by methods of subversion, propaganda, and economic penetration that cannot be excluded by military agreements and arrangements. And at no time did these military agreements and arrangements provide any real strength to keep Russia out as a military threat for at all times. That task rested on the deterrent power of the United States and the Western Alliance. The sole consequence of the Dulles efforts to do so, the wrong thing, along the Pakistani-Peruvian axis, has been to increase what he was seeking to reduce: local political instability, increased communist and Soviet influence, neutralism, and hatred of the United States. Do you really think they were doing it by accident? Although the dullest period, because it was a crucial period, shows most clearly the failures of American foreign policy in Latin America, I thought they needed to continue to have wars. So maybe it wasn't a failed policy since they can keep continuing to have wars. The situation was the same, both before and since Dulles, with a possible brief exception in the first administration of Franklin Roosevelt. Otherwise, American policy in Latin America has been determined by American needs and desires and not by the problems of Latin Americans. A brief survey of these policies will show this clearly. There are four chief periods in United States policy towards Latin America in the 20th century. The first, a period of investment and interventionism, lasted until 1933 and was basically a period of commercial imperialism. American money came to Latin America as investments, seeking profits out of the exploitation of the area's most obvious local resources, mineral or agricultural, such as copper, bananas, and petroleum, or markets for American goods. There was little respect for the people themselves or for their way of life, and intervention by American military and diplomatic forces was always close at hand as a protection for American profits and investments. The Good Neighbor policy, announced by President Roosevelt in 1933, reduced intervention while retaining investment. It was partly a consequence of the idealism and progressive nature of the New Deal itself, but was equally based on the fact that the needs of Latin America for American investment funds and for the American market, especially in the depressed conditions of 1933, made it so amenable to our economic and commercial influence that there was little need for us to use for our use of diplomatic intimidation or the Marines. The third and fourth stages in Latin American policy, from 1940 to the present, have been concerned with our efforts to involve the area in our foreign policy, not theirs. That is, in the efforts to get them as deeply involved as possible in the struggle against Hitler and Japan, and since 1947, in the struggle against the Soviet Union. Both of these efforts have been mistakes, with the possible exception of our relations with Brazil and Mexico in the period following 1940, because the states of Latin America, however dutifully they may have lined up in the hot war against Hitler or the Cold War against Soviet Russia, contributed little more to victory in these struggles than they would have contributed if they had not been pressured by us to line up at all. This four-stage chronology of American policy towards Latin America ignores completely the significant change that has occurred in the history of Latin America itself during the 20th century, chiefly in the 1950s. This is the shift in emphasis in Latin American history, especially in the history of political disturbances and governmental changes, from the superficial coup d'etat that they were prevalent in the 19th century and early 20th centuries to the profound economic and social upheavals that first appeared in Mexico in 1910 and were followed in the 1950s by the revolution in Bolivia, Cuba, and elsewhere. The failure in coincidence between the stages of history of American policy and the stages of history of Latin America itself is a fair measure of the irrelevance and futility of our policy. That this failure continued into the 1960s was clear in Washington's joy at the military coup. At the military coup that ejected the left of center João Goulart government from Brazil in April 1964. For that government, however misdirected and incompetent, at least recognized that there were urgent social and economic problems in Brazil demanding treatment. No real recognition that such problems existed was achieved in Washington until Castro's revolution in Cuba forced the realization. As a consequence, the Alliance for Progress should be regarded as the North American reaction to Castro rather than its reaction to Latin America's real problems. This helps to explain why the achievement of the Alliance for Progress has been so limited. In its early announcement by President Kennedy during his second month in office, the projected Alliance for Progress seemed more hopeful than any earlier United States reaction to Latin America's problems had been. It accepted the idea of central economic planning for the Latin American nations and the role of state intervention in investment and economic life, both of which had been rejected by the Eisenhower administration. To these, it added two other basic assumptions: that Latin America be required to take steps to help itself and not merely expect grants from the United States, and also that social improvements such as better housing, increased literacy, and improved social amenities be regarded as intrinsic parts of, or even prerequisites to, purely economic expansion, and not be considered as hitherto to be incidental consequences of such expansion. The formal agreement for the Alliance for Progress was signed by all members of the Organization of American States except Cuba at Punta del Este, Uruguay on August 17, 1961. Its aims and attitudes were admirable, but required implementation and organizational features that were not covered in the Charter itself and have largely remained deficient since. Its preamble said, in part, "We, the American republics, hereby proclaim our decision to unite in a common effort to bring our people accelerated economic progress and broader social justice within the framework of personal dignity and personal liberty." Almost 200 years ago, we began in this hemisphere the long struggle for freedom, which now inspires people in all parts of the world. Now we must give a new meaning to that revolutionary heritage, for America stands at a turning point in history. The men and women of our hemisphere are reaching for the better life, which today's skills have placed within their grasp. They are determined for themselves and their children to have decent and ever more abundant lives, to gain access to knowledge and equal opportunity for all, to end those conditions which benefit the few at the expense of the needs and dignity of the many. These were fine words, and the specific details to fulfill them was generally recognized. The latter included a substantial and sustained growth of per capita incomes at a rate designed to attain, at the earliest possible date, levels of income capable of assuring self-sustaining development and sufficient to make Latin American income levels constantly larger in relation to the levels of the more industrialized nations. In evaluating the degree of relative development, account will be taken not only of average levels of real income and gross product per capita, but also of indices of infant mortality, illiteracy, and per capita daily caloric intake. The minimum desirable rate of economic growth was stated to be 2.5% per capita per year. It was perhaps unrealistically stated that economic progress should be made available to all citizens of all economic and social groups through a more equitable distribution of national income, raising more rapidly the income and standard of living of the needier sectors of the population, at the same time that the higher proportion of national product is devoted to investment. This aim to redistribute income and achieve simultaneously higher consumption and higher investment is, of course, impossible, except in the most advanced industrial societies that have already reached such levels of consumption of material goods that further increases in consumption increase problems rather than solve them. To add to this rather confused idea of the process of economic development, the Charter immediately added special attention should be given to the establishment and deployment of capital goods industries. Other desirable goals listed in the Charter included replacing latifundia and dwarf holdings by an equitable system of land tenure, to maintain stable price levels, avoiding inflation or deflation and the consequent social hardships and maldistribution of resources, to strengthen existing agreements on economic integration, and to develop cooperative programs designed to prevent the harmful effects of excessive fluctuations in the foreign exchange earnings derived from exports of primary products. Among the social goals were to eliminate adult illiteracy by 1970, to assure as a minimum access of 6 years of primary education for each school-age child in Latin America, to increase life expectancy at birth by a minimum of 5 years, and to increase the ability to learn and produce by improving individual and public health, to provide adequate potable water supply and drainage to not less than 70% of the urban and 50% of the rural population, to reduce the mortality rate of children less than 5 years of age to at least 1/2 of the present rate, to control the more serious transmittable diseases according to their importance as a cause of sickness and death, and so on. The methods of achieving these desirable goals were only incidentally established in the Charter. The participating Latin American countries were required to formulate within 18 months long-term development programs that would include improved human resources through education and training, a reform of tax structures, including adequate taxation of large incomes in real estate, laws to encourage investment, both foreign and domestic, and improved methods of distribution to provide more competitive markets. The drawing of such programs in areas that lacked adequate statistical information and had few trained economists was a considerable obstacle to carrying out the Charter, and only a handful of programs were approved in the first 3 years of the alliance. As part of the Charter, the United States offered to provide assistance under the alliance amounting to $20 billion, of which half was to come from the government and half from private sources over a 10-year period. Nothing was said in the Charter as to the nature of this assistance, but the government's share had been generally in the form of credits, the least helpful type of such foreign assistance, and the amount of such assistance has not, as might appear at first glance, amounted to $2 billion a year in new monies, since private American investments in Latin America already amounted to many hundreds of millions a year, and aid from the United States government was almost equally large, so that the total of additional assistance promised by the alliance was roughly about 2/3 of $1 billion or less each year. It would be possible to state the achievement of the alliance for progress in terms of hundreds of thousands of housing units, schools, new hospitals, roads, additional drinking water, and experimental or demonstration farms. But such lists, however large the numbers, indicate little about the success of the alliance. On the whole, it cannot be said that the alliance has failed, but even more empathetically, it cannot be said that it has been a success. Its achievements have been ameliorative rather than structural, and this alone indicates that it has not been a success. For unless there are structural reforms in Latin American society, its economic development will not become self sustaining or even manage to keep up with the growth of population on the basis of or of income per capita. The failure of the Alliance for Progress to achieve what it was touted to achieve has many causes, but the chief is undoubtedly that it was not intended primarily to be a method for achieving a better life for Latin Americans, but was intended to be a means of implementing American policy in the Cold War. This became clearly evident as the Second Punta del Este Conference of January 22nd to the 31st, 1962, where Washington's exclusive control over the granting of funds for the alliance was used as a club to force the Latin American states to exclude Cuba from the Organization of American States. The original plan was to cut off Cuba's trade with all Western Hemisphere countries and to break off diplomatic relations as well. A two-thirds vote by countries was needed to make the recommendation official. It was obtained only by the minimum margin, 14 votes of the 21 members, and only after the most intense American diplomatic pressure and and bribery involving the granting and withholding of American aid to the alliance. Even at that, 6 countries representing 75% of Latin America's area and 70% of its population refused to vote for the American motions. These 6 were Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, Chile, Bolivia, and Ecuador. Much of the weakness of the Alliance for Progress arises from its failure to work for structural reforms that will change the patterns of Latin American life in more constructive directions. The aid, as we have said, is entirely under the control of the United States. It generally takes the form not of money which can be used to buy the best goods in the cheapest market, but as credits which can be used only in the United States. Much of these credits goes either to fill gaps in the budgets or the foreign exchange balances of Latin American countries, which provide a maximum of leverage in getting these governments to follow America's lead in world affairs, but provides little or no benefit to the impoverished peoples of the hemisphere. Moreover, the grants, which provide dollars to these countries, are often counterbalanced by contrary influences such as increased tariffs or other restrictions on the flow of Latin American goods to the United States, or decreases in the prices of Latin American primary products, or what leads to the same results, increases in the export prices of American industrial goods. A decrease of a cent or two in the price that the United States pays for coffee can wipe out all the funds that it provides for the coffee-producing countries under the Alliance for Progress. For example, from 1959 to 1960, the price that the United States paid for its coffee fell from an average of 39 cents a pound to 34 cents a pound. This decrease of a nickel a pound would represent a decrease in the total amount the United States paid for coffee from one year to the next of more than $150 million for the 30 billion pounds bought in 1960. Similarly, a decrease of 1 cent per pound on Chile's copper means a loss of about $11 million a year. On the other hand, an increase in the prices of American television sets of $1 each cost Latin American buyers about $15 million. So basically, they're giving them credits to buy stuff from the United States or exchange stuff for their goods, but then we keep dropping the price of their goods and raising the price of our goods, so it cancels out any loan that we give them, which is just genius, because then we're forcing them to buy American products. It's pretty much the same thing as the petrodollar, where they have to buy American stocks and bonds with the dollars that they get in exchange for the oil. When both occur together, so that the prices of what Latin America sells are falling, while the prices that it has to pay for American goods are increasing, as has been generally true during recent years, it means that most of the funds that Washington extends to Latin America under the Alliance for Progress are evaporating before they can be used in terms of the total amount of dollars available for Latin American purchases of goods and equipment needed to modernize the Latin American production system. So they just run an algorithm and make sure that you just never get quite enough money to get out of debt. It's the same thing they do here. The same thing they do everywhere, basically. There are many other aspects of this situation that help to explain the weak achievement of the Alliance for Progress. The tax reform projects designed to force the rich to pay their fair share of taxes and to encourage them to invest rather than simply to hoard their surplus funds have come to almost nothing. But the possibility that something of this nature might be done has caused large volumes of funds to flee from Latin America to seek shelter abroad. It is possible that the total of such Latin American funds hiding abroad may amount to as much as $20 billion, the same amount the United States promised to provide over the whole 10 years of the alliance's projected life. While we have no accurate figures on these sums, the official report gives $4 billion as the amount of Latin American money on deposit in the United States at the end of 1961. All of these considerations make it clear that the problems of our neighbors in the Western Hemisphere are still rising more rapidly than they are being solved, a condition equally true in Southern Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Near East. In all of these, failure to find some answers to the problems that are rising can only lead to neutralism, eventually hatred of the Western world, and violent explosion by disappointed peoples that achieve nothing constructive either for them or for us. There are those that say that all these disappointments are inevitable because the problems of the backward areas are basically insoluble. To these skeptics, we need only say, look at the Far East, where, in vivid contrast, we can see the outstanding case where the problem of development has been solved and the most frightening example of what may happen when it is not solved. All right, the Far East. From the opening of the Far East to Western trade and influence, largely at the insistence of American traders, China was the recipient of American favor and protection, while Japan was regarded with suspicion and rivalry. The culmination of this process was in World War II, when China was an ally and Japan was our enemy. In fact, as Pearl Harbor showed, American intervention in the war arose over its efforts to protect China from Japanese aggression. Yet, in the post-war period, this relation was reversed. Japan now represents the greatest success and China the greatest failure of America's post-war foreign policy. Our policies are often praised or blamed for these discordant results, but they should not be, for it could easily be argued that we were hardly aware of what we were doing in either case, and the outcomes were the consequence of forces quite beyond our control. This almost certainly is correct in China, but the amazing success story that is to be seen in contemporary Japan may well be attributed to successful American policies in combination with the particular social and personality patterns of the Japanese people. The Japanese miracle. The word miracle has been applied to a number of post-war events. such as the economic upsurge in West Germany, but it is nowhere more applicable than in Japan. For Japan is the only major area outside Europe, except the United States itself, which has reached that stage in economic development which W. Rostow called takeoff. That is, it has reached a point of development where the process continues by its own momentum, accumulating and investing its own capital, with increasing production of food from a constantly dwindling farm population, a shift in diet from emphasis on energy foods to emphasis on protective foods, and a shift in industry activity away from products requiring unskilled labor in a low capital to labor ratio towards products requiring highly skilled labor in a high capital to labor ratio. The Soviet Union itself has not yet reached this point in development, so that Japan is now the only fully advanced industrial nation in Asia and has, as a consequence, taken on characteristics that are familiar to us from Western European and American experience, but are totally unknown elsewhere in Asia, Latin America, or Africa. As a consequence, Japan is, for these still backwards areas, a more helpful model of economic development than either the United States or Western Europe, since these two earlier examples of development did not have to face some of the problems, such as lack of resources and heavy population pressure on the land, which Japan was able to overcome. Thus, a Peace Corps of missionaries for development techniques would be more helpful from Japan than the present American Peace Corps of recently graduated college students on the ground of technical experience, if not on the ground of humanitarian motivation. The key to the Japanese takeoff rests, as it must, on the relationship between population growth and food supply. Japan, whose population growth from 44 million in 1900 to 93 million in 1960 once made it a prime example of an overpopulated country, now has a demographic pattern of Western industrial society. It has one of the world's lowest births and death rates and a life expectancy of 65 years for males and 70 for females, with an increasing percentage of older persons. The birth rate and death rate per 1,000 were both cut in half from 1946 to 1961, the former from 34.6 to 16.9, and the latter from 15.3 to 7.4. By 1963, Japan had the lowest death rate in the world, about 7 per 1,000. As a result of these factors, the population increase of Japan, which was once over 1,700,000 a year, is now about 900,000 yearly and fell in 1959 to 780,000. It is expected that Japan's population may reach a peak of about 107 million by 1990 and then begin to decrease, falling below 100 million again by 2010. They already predicted the population decline back then. This changing population picture in Japan owes nothing to the American military occupation and rests very largely on the strong, self-disciplined, inscrutable Japanese character. Of this, we know very little. There have been a number of studies of the Japanese personality, the best known of which, by Ruth Benedict and Jeffrey Gorer, are based on no real personal knowledge and on impressionistic evidence. The truth is that the Japanese personality seems to have an achieving pattern, but at present we know very little about it. At any rate, the Japanese solution of their population explosion rests very largely on aspects of their personality structure. Abortion plays a much greater role in their population control than would be acceptable to many persons in our Western culture. Unlike their population control, The recent Japanese success in producing food owes a great deal to the American occupation. This Japanese agrarian reform is one of the remarkable economic transformations of this century. With 650 persons per square mile compared to 50 in the United States and 25 in the Soviet Union, Japan has only 2/10 of an acre of arable land per person, and most farms are merely gardens of less than 2 acres. By 1940, about 70% of Japanese farmers were paying rent for land and almost 30% were landless. Rents were high, and agrarian discontent became one of the chief pressures behind Japanese aggression in the 1930s. At that time, the land was extensively exploited in the Asiatic fashion by applying larger amounts of hand labor to it. Much of it was terraced, more than half of it was irrigated. There was intensive application of fertilizers, including human waste, and the chief emphasis was on energy-yielding food, mostly rice. The reorganization of Japanese agriculture was largely due to the American military occupation, SCAP, and was so successful that the index of agricultural production increased 40% in the decade 1951 to 1960. This revolution rested on two supports: the agrarian reform and technological advances. The agrarian reform redistributed the ownership of land by the government, taking all individual land holdings beyond 7.5 acres, all rented lands over 2.5 acres, and the land of absentee owners. The former holders were paid for these lands with long-term bonds. In turn, peasants without land or with less than the minimum permitted amount of 7.5 acres were allowed to buy land from the state on a long-term, low-interest rate basis. Cash rents for land were also lowered. As a result of this program, Japan became a land of peasant owners, with about 90% of the cultivated soil worked by its owners. The peasants were helped in making the transfer because the early period of occupation was one of food shortages, inflation, and an active black market with high prices. These profits also helped finance the beginnings of the new revolution in agricultural technology. This drastic change in farming methods in Japan was towards the American method of farm development, using less and less hand labor and greater amounts of capital, especially in farm machinery and fertilizers. Today, all kinds of power and mechanical equipment, such as threshers, pumps, lift, sprayers, and such, are common in Japan. Most spectacular has been the spreading of hand tractors or power cultivators of 3 to 7 horsepowers, something like American rototillers. These have increased from 7,000 in use in 1947 to 85,000 in 1955 and to almost a million by 1962. These can be used with special attachments as plows, cultivators, pumps, sprayers, saws, and draft vehicles, and have helped to eliminate draft farm animals and to reduce heavy human labor. Since a farmer can do as much work, especially plowing, with this piece of equipment in one day as used to require 10 days' work using animal power, he has a longer growing season, can extend the practice of double cropping, and has much more time for other work. Two aspects of this agricultural revolution deserve special mention. Japan, like the United States, is now shifting its diet from energy foods like rice towards protective foods like meat, milk, fruit, and green vegetables. And Japan, also like the United States, has now broken free from the older alternative of either high output per acre or high output per unit of labor, and has now reached the stage where both are rising together. In the 10 years of this agricultural revolution, 1951 to 1961, rice production went up 30%, but dairy cattle increased 10 times, meat products about 3, fruit production almost doubled, and the number of persons engaged in farming has fallen rapidly by better than 10% or more than 1.5 million persons in the 5 years 1956 to 1961. As a result, the percentage of the working population engaged in farming is now about 28% and has a steadily increasing portion of older persons and of families as the younger males stream steadily to the city seeking jobs in industry. Of course, this transformation in agriculture could never have occurred if there had not been taking place equally drastic changes in industry. These industrial changes, including a high rate of investment, rapid technological change, and excellent demand for industrial products, provided a plentiful supply of jobs and increased demand for food and other agricultural products by city dwellers. These conditions acted like a magnet to attract a growing flood of farm products and energetic young peasants to the cities. The contrast between the structure and distribution of Japan's population and that of other Asiatic nations shows clearly that Japan is no longer a backward, undeveloped, or colonial area from any point of view. The marks of such a backward society are usually a high birth rate and death rate, a largely young rural population with the great majority in agriculture and mostly illiterate. In Japan, all of these characteristics are untrue. Birth and death rates are very low. The population is aging rapidly, is almost totally literate, has below 19% in agriculture, and has over 60% resident in areas classified as urban. Moreover, the revolution in Japanese industrial development has shifted the country out of its previous colonial orientation in economic organization and commerce. Before the war, Japan lived by exporting labor, largely unskilled labor. It did this by importing raw materials, working them up by largely unskilled labor into products of light industry, chiefly textiles, and exporting these products for more raw materials and food. Today, the Japanese need for imported food is decreasing and shifting away from its previous food needs, notably rice, to foods more protective character such as proteins. At the same time, its raw material imports are slowly shifting from those used in light industry, such as raw cotton, to those used in highly skilled industrial lines, such as electronics, where few other nations can compete. This inevitably means that Japan's trade has been shifting from Asia and other backward areas, where it has exchanged cotton textiles for rice, to the United States and Europe, where it exchanges cameras, radios, tape recorders, and optical supplies for metal, manufactured goods, or materials for advanced industry. Its needs for petroleum, iron ore, and other bulk raw materials are tending to shift to colonial areas, so that its petroleum now comes from the Persian Gulf instead of the United States, and its iron ore comes increasingly from India. The social impact of economic changes such as these is far-reaching. The cities are growing rapidly, while many rural areas are losing population as their people flock to urban areas. By 1961, 44% of the total population was clustered in 1% of the country's total area. Tokyo, with 7 million people in 1940, was down to 3 million in 1945 and passed 10 million in 1960. Other cities grew steadily, but at a slower rate, and by the present day are agglomerating into four megalopolitan areas. Tens of millions of commuters swarm into these to work each day, and the traffic problem, especially in Tokyo, has become almost insoluble. As might be expected, such rapid material advance and profound social change has given rise to all kinds of social problems. Family discipline has weakened, and the older Japanese morality and outlooks are now widely rejected. Marxism and existentialism vie for the allegiance of the educated, while the less esoterically informed are satisfied with the pursuit of material success and personal pleasures. The gap between these two groups is considerable, and much of the stability of political and social and much of the stability, both political and social, in Japanese society today seems to rise from the self satisfaction of the new middle class and the eagerness of many peasants and workers to get into that class and enjoy its benefits. It's like the boomers, basically, Japanese boomers. These benefits increasingly provide a life like that in American suburbia with television, baseball, bulldozers, picture windows, neon lighted department stores, mass advertising, instant food, and weekly slick magazines. The speed with which this has come about is almost beyond belief. Commercial television began in Japan in 1953. 5 years later, 16% of urban households had a set, but by 1961, 72% had sets. Electric washing machines increased from 29% of the urban houses in 1958 to 55% 3 years later. This salaried middle class is the key to rapid advancement and political stability of Japan. Ambitious, hardworking, loyal, reliable, very adaptable to bureaucratic organization, scientific training, and rationalizing processes, they are suspicious of ideologies or extremist doctrines of any kind and form one of the world's most amazing peoples. So it looks like normies, Japanese boomer normies. It's the same thing in America. It's like we were politically stable when the middle class was getting bigger, when like nobody was really bothering like the normie boomers. But now they're taking away all the material things that they used to like enjoy. Like that was their whole like pursuit of life. They're like, okay, well, if God doesn't exist, at least I can be comfortable and my wife can be happy. And then they took that away too. And they're like, no, you can't even do that. It's like you either are homeless or you're like a rich person, and that's it. And that's why there's political instability. And like he was saying previously, when you get political instability, then people go to the right and left extreme politics because they don't trust the government. Because the only thing the government is there to do is provide political stability. So when it's not providing that, then people to go to the extremes and want to take down the government. Kind of makes sense. These general attitudes have been given Japan. These general attitudes have given Japan the appearance of successful adaptation to democratic political life as determined by the SCAP imposed Constitution of 1947. As a matter of fact, the Japanese are basically uneasy about individualism, democracy, mass society, and the speed of their economic change, but few have much of an urge to rock the boat, and those old enough to remember the years of tension and war from 1931 to 1944 have no preference for them. They are discontented groups, including the ultranationalist on the extreme right and the vicarious socialist, communist, and student groups on the left. Both of these extremes, especially the former, operate in an atmosphere of considerable unreality. The really notable feature of Japanese political ideology is the way in which the SCAP's agrarian reform has driven communism out of the rural areas and restricted it to the cities, chiefly to student groups. Yeah, because the farmers don't want to starve. The foundations of the present political system in Japan were established by the SCAP in the early years of the occupation. In the early months of peace, 5 million Japanese military were demobilized, 3 million civilians were repatriated from overseas. When Japanese prisoners of war were eventually returned, about 375,000 in the hands of the Russians were never accounted for. More than 4,200 Japanese were convicted of war crimes, over 700 were executed, and about 2,500 were sentenced to life imprisonment. An additional 220,000 persons were permanently excluded from public life, and about 1,300 nationalist and extremist organizations were banned. Once the normies get into power, they ban all the extremists. The Shinto religion was separated from the state, forbidden to propagate militaristic or ultranationalist doctrines. Emperor Hirohito was forced to issue a public statement denying that he was divine. A Japanese Bill of Rights protecting the rights of individuals and political freedoms on a much more extensive basis than we have in the United States was issued in 1945. The centralized police control in the Home Ministry was abolished. The police powers were curbed. A new civil code established freedom from family domination for all and equality for females. The Constitution itself, issued by SCAP in 1946, provided that a prime minister be chosen by the 467 members of the House of Representatives, who themselves were chosen by universal adult suffrage. These were elected from 118 electoral constituencies, each represented by from 3 to 5 members, although the voter could cast his ballot for only one candidate. This ensured representation for minority views and made it difficult to obtain a majority in the House without coalitions of parties. However, the parties have tended to coalesce into two wings around the conservative Liberal Democrats and the Socialist Party. That's funny. That's pretty much how America is now. It's like conservative liberals, Democrats, which is the Republicans, are basically conservative liberal Democrats, and then the left is now socialist. Except for the period April 1947 to October 1948, when the socialists controlled the government during a period of extreme labor unrest and violence, control has been in the hands of the Liberal Democratic Party and its allied groups. These have generally won almost 2/3 of the seats in elections over the last 10 years since 1955, while the socialists have had difficulty in obtaining 1/3 of the seats. The chief differences between the two parliamentary groups revolve around foreign affairs, with the Liberal Democrats committed to a pro-Western policy in strong alliance with the United States and rather isolated from Asia. The Socialist group wishes to weaken the American connection and resume Japan's traditional position as a leading Asiatic power. The economic orientation of Japan is its booming prosperity. The economic orientation of Japan and its booming prosperity have made the task of socialist a difficult one. The different views of the two parties in domestic politics are reflected in a controversy over the Constitution. This document, in Article 9, renounces war and forbids maintaining an army, navy, or air force. Despite this, in July 1950, General MacArthur ordered formation of a defense force, and the United States insisted on this at the time of the peace treaty with Japan the following year. The Mutual Defense Alliance with the United States, signed in March 1952, bound Japan to maintain a defense force of 275,000 men. Since this force is unconstitutional, the socialists have sought vigorously to keep their parliamentary representation at over one-third of the seats to prevent an amendment removing Article 9. All amendments require a two-thirds vote of the parliament plus a majority in a national referendum. However, even in 1963, when the socialists made a desperate effort to obtain one-third of the seats, 156, they fell 12 seats short of the necessary number. They have received little help from the communists, whose parliamentary representatives rose to a peak of 35 seats in the distributed period of 1949, but they alienated the Japanese by their addiction to violence and have elected only a handful of members since 1950, none in 1952, following the May Day riots of that year, and only 3 in 1960, increased to 5 in 1963. So we can see these communists have been pulling these May Day riots for quite a while now. On the whole, Japan in the 20th century has been an extraordinary country, and this characterization does not decrease with the passing years. It is a bulwark of strength to the Western Bloc, not because of its military power, which is insignificant, or even as an American military base in the Far East, but because it, like West Germany, is an example of the freedom and prosperity associated with being an American satellite, in contrast with the unhappy plight of the Soviet satellite states. Above all, Japan, for the neutrals and the backward areas of the world, is living proof that it is possible to advance from backwardness and slavery to prosperity and freedom. All right, the next section is going to be the communist China. Now, I think one point that he's really missing here is the whole IQ score stuff when it comes to why certain countries are developing and certain countries aren't. I know you don't want to go there, we don't want to go there, but they didn't really have these type of results back then, and you can chalk it all up to, what did he say, the national character and the national personalities, and they didn't want to do individualism. Well, why were there so many illiterate people, right? It's like once the Americans came there and set up schools in all these Latin American countries and Pakistan, and I guess India's doing pretty good, but, in some of the rural areas and in Africa, and they gave the same exact stuff that they gave to Japan, and they gave the same stuff that they gave to China. And while China was like more difficult to develop, we can see now China's doing fine. Some people might even say they're more advanced than Western countries. Like South Korea, probably more advanced than like Europe. And there's, he can come up with all these different explanations about personal character of the nation, and this war happened and that war happened, and the communists taught him this, but look at Russia. Russia was communist, and as soon as they stopped being communist, they're advanced, right? Northeast Asia, advanced. Parts of India, advanced, right? Europe, advanced. But for some reason, Latin America and Africa, all the sub-equatorial regions of the world, which just happen to be more populated with dark-skinned people, and scientifically, I'm not saying I'm a scientist, but if you just look at the world IQ chart, it just happens to be that these countries just happen to be the countries with the lowest average IQ per capita, and they happen to also be the ones that aren't getting developed. And we can say, well, it's just the national character of Japan. It's just the national character of China. Just the national character of Europe that caused them to advance, and not these other countries, right? In Latin America and Africa, basically, right? So, he's not going to say it, though. And that's part of the problem with this like liberal outlook, where it's like, oh, well, if we just, teach them how to change their national character a little bit, then they'll be like in the Jetsons, right? So it's just something to think about when he's talking about all this stuff. And obviously, like, you can see the other political implications, like when it doesn't work, then the country's like, well, how come westernization didn't work in our country? We're going to do a communism, right? And now you can see that happening in the United States, where, you know, people aren't getting the high standards of living, or even the middle class standard of living, that is what keeps a country politically stable and united. Like when people can have families and they feel proud to go to their job, like they feel like if they tell someone what their job is, the person's not going to go, oh, you do that, oh my god, I can't even talk to you anymore, right? Like they want to feel proud about their job, they want to feel proud about their family, their community. And yeah, a lot of people want material comforts. You know, they want to look and see, oh, if my neighbor has a TV, I can afford a TV. If my neighbor can afford Uber, I want to be able to afford Uber, right? And it's just a basic, you know, human psychology thing. And when you can't provide that, then yeah, people start going to political extremes of communism, fascism, national socialism, whatever other extreme right wing or left wing political ideology you want to name, right? So there is a lot to, you know, the society keeping the like middle class normies like happy. Because when the middle class normies aren't happy, society falls apart, as we can see. So I'll get out of here with that. Thanks for watching the video if you did. If you didn't, you won't hear this part anyway. So have a good day and peace.